Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Adventure and Mystery Book Club. I'm Bill Mallory, branch manager of the La Jolla Library. So glad you could be here with me today as we read. We're going to be reading chapters 11 and 12 of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea by Jules Verne. All good stuff. The story is really picking up right now. Our heroes, there are three of our main heroes right now. A professor of marine biology, Pierre Aronnax. We have his faithful manservant Conseil, and we have a Canadian harpooner, Ned Land, and they have all been rescued from the ocean by this mysterious submarine that has been attacking ships throughout the world for about a year now, and they have just in the last couple of chapters, the last time we read, it was revealed that the person in charge of this amazing vessel is Captain Nemo. So Captain Nemo has finally introduced himself at this stage, and he has revealed the name of his submarine as the Nautilus. So our heroes were imprisoned for a little bit. Now that Captain Nemo has revealed himself, he is just kind of talking with the group. I wouldn't say he's necessarily cordial because he has stated one of the first things he mentioned is that he has broken all ties with humanity. So he has no love of the world that exists on land. He does not acknowledge their laws. He lives in the ocean entirely using ocean resources. Professor Aronnax is treated to a feast made entirely of sea things, animals, invertebrates. The dolphin livers are mentioned at one point. Sea turtle steaks, things like that. Anemone jam. Everything that comes from the sea, whether plant or animal, is used in this sort of marvelous feast, which Professor Aronnax is very impressed with. And he has told them that while they are not going to be able to leave the Nautilus, they have free reign and are able to walk around freely as if they were any other member of the crew. And of course, there's a lot of crew members on board, and what has been revealed is that they are apparently speaking a language that is unique to them. They haven't really gotten into that part yet, but there is a language that Nemo speaks to the crew, and they already between them know English, French, German, and Latin. So it's not any of those, but they've decided that they're gonna learn more about this. So Ned Land and Conseil went to their own place to have a meal with just the two of them, while Captain Nemo takes Professor Aronnax and has this sort of sumptuous feast and explains his position, his lack of interest in the surface world, and how everything he needs he gets from the sea. So, if you're ready, we will start with chapter 11. Now, I'm going to warn you here, there are some challenging words in this chapter, so I'm going to ask for your patience and probably your forgiveness. Chapter 11 is entitled The Nautilus. Captain Nemo got up, and I followed him. A double door in the back of the dining room opened, and we entered another room the same size as the one we had just left. It was a library. A large collection of uniformly bound books was set in high bookcases of black Brazilian rosewood inlaid with brass. They followed the shape of the room, and at their base were huge couches covered in brown leather and curved so as to give greater comfort. In front of them stood small movable desks on which one could rest the book one was reading, and which could be drawn up or pushed away at will. In the middle of the room there was a huge table covered with pamphlets and a few old newspapers. This whole ensemble was bathed in electric light coming from 4 frosted glass globes in the ceiling. I stood in wonder before this room so ingeniously fitted out, and I could not believe my eyes. "Captain Nemo," I said to my host, who had just stretched out on a divan, "this library would do honor to to more than one place on land, and I am really astounded to think that it travels with you into the ocean depths." "Where could one find greater solitude or silence, Professor?" replied Captain Nemo. "Can you boast of greater tranquillity in your office in the museum?" "No, monsieur. I must admit that it is very shabby alongside yours. Why, you have 6 or 7 thousand books." 12,000, Monsieur Aronnax. These are my only ties with life on dry land, a life which ended for me the day my Nautilus first dove beneath the surface of the ocean. That day I bought my last books, pamphlets, and newspapers, and since then I have preferred to think that humanity has neither thought nor written anything. Moreover, Professor, you may feel free to use these books whenever you wish." I thanked Captain Nemo and went over to the bookshelves. There were all sorts of works on science, morality, and literature written in every known language, but I did not see a single book on politics or economy. It seemed as if such works were completely forbidden on board. There was, however, one odd thing about the library. All the books were arranged without thought for the language in which they were written, and this mixture proved that the captain of the Nautilus could read effortlessly whatever book came to hand. Among them I noticed all the masterpieces of ancient and modern writers, that is to say, the most beautiful works history has produced. Poetry, fiction, and science from Homer to Victor Hugo, from Xenophon to Michelet, from Rabelais to George Sand. But this library leaned heavily towards science. Books on mechanics, ballistics, hydrography, meteorology, geography, geology, etc. took up no less space than works on natural history, and I understood that all this formed the captain's principal source of study. I saw there all of Humboldt's works, all of Arago, Foucault, Henry St. Clair Deville, Charles Milne Edwards, Quatrefages, Tyndall, Faraday, Berthelot, Secchi, Peterman, Commander Maury, Agassiz, etc., the memoirs of the Academy of Science, the bulletins of various geographical societies, etc., and, in a conspicuous place, the 2 volumes which had perhaps won me this relatively warm reception on the part of Captain Nemo. Among the works of Joseph Bertrand, his book called The Founders of Astronomy, furnished me with a date, since I knew that it had appeared during the year 1865. I could conclude that the Nautilus could not have been launched before this date. Thus, it was no more than 3 years, at most, since Captain Nemo had begun his underwater existence. I hoped that more recent works would allow me to arrive at a more exact date, but I had plenty of time to undertake this project later, and I did not want to further delay our tour through the wonders of the Nautilus. "Monsieur," I said, "I would like to thank you for allowing me to use this library. It contains many scientific treasures that will be very useful to me." "This room is not only a library," said Captain Nemo, "but also a smoking room." "A smoking room?" I cried. "Do you smoke on board?" "Certainly." "I am therefore forced to believe, monsieur, that you still maintain relations with Havana." "Not at all," answered the captain. "Try this cigar, Monsieur Aronnax. Even though it doesn't come from Havana, you will appreciate it if you are a connoisseur." I took the cigar he offered me. In form, it resembled those from Cuba, but it seemed to be made of gold leaf. I lit it with a little brazier set in an elegant bronze stand, and I took my first puffs with all the delight of a habitual smoker who had not had a cigar in 2 days. It's excellent, I said, but it isn't made of tobacco. No, replied the captain. This tobacco comes neither from Havana nor from the Orient. It's made from a kind of seaweed rich in nicotine, which I get from the sea, not without some difficulty. Do you still miss your Havana cigars, monsieur? Captain, from now on I wouldn't even look at one. Then please feel free to take one whenever you want, and without worrying about where they come from. Even though there is no label to guarantee their quality, they're still not bad. On the contrary. Just when Captain Nemo opened another door opposite the one through which we had entered, and I was led into a huge, splendidly lit room. It had 4 walls, with the corners cut off at angles. It was 33 feet long, 20 feet wide, and 16 feet high. A luminous ceiling decorated with small arabesques gave off a soft, clear light on the wonders brought together in this museum. For it was a veritable museum in which an intelligent, prodigal hand had brought together all the treasures of nature and art and placed them about in a slightly helter-skelter fashion, giving somewhat the impression of an artist's studio. 30 or so paintings by famous masters, uniformly framed and separated by trophies, decorated the walls hung with tapestries of severe design. There I saw the works of greatest value, and which, for the most part, I had already admired in private European collections or art exhibits. The various schools of the earlier masters were represented by a Madonna of Raphael, a Virgin of Leonardo da Vinci, a nymph of Correggio, a woman by Titian, an Adoration of the Magi by Veronese, an Assumption by Murillo, a portrait by Holbein, a monk of Velasquez, a martyr by Ribera, a village fair by Rubens, 2 Flemish landscapes by Teniers, 3 little genre paintings by Gerard Duau, Metsu and Paul Porter, 2 works by Géricault, Proudhon, several seascapes by Bakhuyzen and Vernet. Among the works of modern painters, there were pictures designed by Delacroix, Ingres, Decamps, Troyon, Meissonier, Daubigny, etc. Small models of marble and bronze statues, copied from the loveliest works of antiquity, stood on pedestals in the corners of this magnificent museum. That state of stupefaction which the commander of the Nautilus had predicted was beginning to take hold of my mind. Professor, the strange man then said, I hope you will excuse the informal way I have received you, and also the disorder reigning in this room. Monsieur, I replied, without trying to find out who you are, I hope you will permit me to recognize you as an artist. Merely an amateur, monsieur, nothing more. I used to enjoy collecting beautiful works collected by the hand of man. I used to search and hunt for them avidly, and I have been able to collect some objects of great value. These are my last memories of life on earth, which is dead as far as I am concerned. In my eyes, your modern artists were already ancient, and 2,000 or 3,000 years of existence, and I confuse them all in my mind. Great artists are ageless. And musicians, I said, pointing to the scores by Weber, Rossini, Mozart, Beethoven, Haydn, Meyerbeer, Herold, Wagner, Auber, Gounod, and many others, all spread out on large organ against one of the walls of the room. "These musicians," answered Captain Nemo, "are all the contemporaries of Orpheus. For differences in time disappear in dead men's memories, and I am dead, Professor, as dead as whatever friends of yours lie 6 feet under." Captain Nemo stopped talking and seemed lost in a deep reverie. I contemplated him with great interest and silently analyzed the strange expression on his face. He was leaning on the corner of a precious inlaid table. He no longer saw me. He forgot I was in the room. Not wanting to disturb him in his withdrawal, I continued looking over the objects collected in this room. Next to works of art, rarities of nature held an important place. They consisted mainly of plants, shells, and other products of the ocean, all of which had undoubtedly been personally collected by Captain Nemo. In the middle of the room, an electrically illuminated jet of water fell back into a bowl made from a single giant clam. This shell, furnished by the largest of Acephalese mollusks, measured about 33 feet around its delicately scalloped rim. But it was even larger than those lovely giant clams given to Francis I by the Republic of Venice, and which the Church of St. Sulpice in Paris has made into 2 huge holy water basins. Around this fountain, beneath elegant glass cases framed in brass, the most precious products of the sea ever beheld by a naturalist were carefully arranged and labeled. The subkingdom of zoophytes was represented by very curious specimens of its 2 divisions of polyps and echinoderms. From the first division, there were organ-pipe corals, sea fans, soft Syrian sponges, Isidae from the Moluccas, sea pens, marvelous Virgularia from Norwegian waters, various umbella, alcinaria, a whole series of madrepores, which my teacher Milne Edwards so wisely classed in sections, and among which I noticed Flabella oculinae from Reunion Island, a Neptune's chariot from the West Indies, some superb types of corals, and all known species of those strange polyparies which gather together to form entire coral islands, which someday will become continents. Some of the echinoderms, notable for their spiny covering, there were starfish, petrosini, feather stars, asterophons, sea urchins, sea cucumbers, etc., thus forming a complete collection of this division. A rather high-strung specialist in seashells would certainly have fainted before other and even more numerous glass cases in which specimens of mollusks were displayed. I saw there a collection of inestimable value, and which lack of time will not permit me to describe in its entirety. Among other things, I will only mention as a reminder the royal hammershell of the Indian Ocean, whose even white spots stood out clearly against a red and brown background. A brightly colored imperial spondylus covered with spines and only rarely found in European museums. I guessed it to be worth $4,000. A common hammer shell from the Australian waters, which is very difficult to obtain. Exotic cockles from Senegal, with their fragile white shells and double valves, which a breath could shatter like a soap bubble. Several varieties of watering pot shells from Java, looking like limestone tubes edged with leaf-like pleats and very highly prized by collectors. A whole series of top shells, some colored greenish, yellow, and fished near the American continent. The others reddish-brown and found in Australian waters. The former, which had come from the Gulf of Mexico, had remarkable shells in overlapping layers. The latter, captured in southern waters, were more star-shaped, and in addition, and rarest of all, there was the magnificent spur shell of New Zealand. then remarkable sulfurized telene, precious species of Venus shells, the trellized solarium from the coasts of Tranquilbar, the marbled turban shell with its gleaming mother of pearl, the green parrot shell from the China Sea, the almost unknown conical shell of the genus Coenodule, all the varieties of cowries used as money in India and Africa, the glory of the sea, the most precious shell of the East Indies, and in addition, Littorine delphinulae, turritelle, ianthinae, ovulae, volutes, olivae, mitrae, helmet shells, purpurae, whelks, harpae, merices, trumpet shells, cerithia, spindle shells, wing shells, pteroceras, limpets, hyalomaces, cleodorae, and all sorts of delicate, fragile shells, which science has baptized with the most charming names. In separate special cases, there were incomparably beautiful strings of pearls which gleamed with fiery sparks beneath the electric light. There were pink pearls taken from the pinnae of the Red Sea, green pearls from the Haliotis iris, yellow, blue, and black pearls, strange products of various mollusks from the world's oceans, and lastly, several specimens of incalculable value produced by the rarest of pearl oysters. Some of these pearls were larger than a pigeon egg. They were as valuable, if not more so, than those the traveler Tavernier sold to the Shah of Persia for $600,000, and they seemed finer than that other pearl belonging to Imam of Muscat, which I had believed unequaled in the whole world. It was, therefore, impossible to estimate the value of this collection. Captain Nemo must have spent millions acquiring these various specimens, and I wondered where he got the money to indulge his collector's whim to such a degree. Suddenly my thoughts were interrupted by the following words. "You've been examining my shells, Professor. I can see why they might interest a naturalist, but to me they have a greater charm. For I have gathered them all with my own hands, and there is no corner of the sea I have left unexplored." "I can easily understand, Captain. What a joy it must be to travel about amid such wealth. You are one of those rare men who have accumulated their treasure themselves. No museum in Europe has such a collection of marine products. But if I use up all my admiration for this, what will be left for the boat that carries it? I don't want to delve into your secrets, but I must admit that this Nautilus, the motor power it contains, the devices by which it is maneuvered, the powerful agent used to drive it, all this excites my curiosity to the highest degree. For instance, hanging over there on the wall, I see some instruments. I haven't the vaguest idea what they're for. Could you tell me?" "Monsieur Aronnax," Captain Nemo replied, "I have already said that you are free on board, and consequently no part of the Nautilus will be closed to you. You can visit the entire ship, and I would consider it a pleasure to act as your guide." "I don't know how to thank you, monsieur, but I would not like to abuse your kindness. I would merely like to know what these instruments—" "Professor, you will see these instruments in my room, and it is there that I will have the pleasure of explaining their purpose. But first, come and look at the cabin I have reserved for you. I want you to see how you will be accommodated on board the Nautilus." I followed Captain Nemo as he led me through a door in the corner of the room and into one of the ship's passageways. After a few steps, we turned into not a cabin, but an elegant room with a bed, dressing table, and various other pieces of furniture. I could only thank my host. "Your room is next to mine," he said, opening the door, "and my cabin gives unto the room we have just left." I entered the captain's cabin. It had a severe, almost monastic look about it. There was an iron cot, a work table, and several dressers, all somewhat dimly lit. No comforts, just the strict necessities. Captain Nemo pointed to a chair. "Please sit down," he said. And I sat down, and he began talking. Chapter 12. All by Electricity. "Monsieur," said Captain Nemo, pointing to the instruments hanging on the walls of his room, "these are the devices needed to navigate the Nautilus. Here, as in the lounge, I have them always in sight, and they tell me my exact position and direction in the middle of the ocean. Some of them you already know, such as the thermometer, which gives the inside temperature of the Nautilus, the barometer, which indicates the atmospheric pressure and predicts changes of weather, the hygrometer, which shows the dryness of the air, the storm glass, whose components decompose and announce the arrival of storms, the compass, which gives me my course, the sextant, which, by determining the height of the sun, gives me my latitude, my chronometers, which permit me to find out my longitude, and, lastly, my telescopes, one for the day, the other for nighttime use, with which I examine every corner of the horizon when the Nautilus is on the surface." "These are the usual nautical instruments," I answered, "and I know how they are used, but I see others which undoubtedly answer the Nautilus's special needs. Isn't that dial with the moving needle a pressure gauge?" "Yes, it's a pressure gauge. It is in contact with the water outside, and by giving me its pressure, it tells me at what depth I'm traveling." "And are these some new kind of sounding lines?" "They are thermometrical sounding lines to give me the temperature of the various layers of water." "And what are these other instruments which are completely unfamiliar to me?" "Before going any further, Professor, I must explain a few things," said Captain Nemo. "So please listen." After a few minutes of silence, he said, "There is one source of power which is obedient and rapid, easy and pliable, and which reigns supreme on board my ship. It does everything. It gives me light, heat, and is the soul of all my machinery. The source is electricity." "Electricity?" I cried, somewhat surprised. "Yes, monsieur." "But, Captain, the great speed with which your ship can move would seem to have little to do with electric power. Until now, its dynamic force has remained very limited and able to produce no more than a very small amount of energy." "Professor," answered Captain Nemo, "my electricity is not the usual kind, but I hope you will permit me not to go into it further." "I won't insist on the matter, monsieur, and I will be quite satisfied to be astounded at the results you have obtained with it. There is one question I would like to ask, however, but you need not answer if it is indiscreet. The materials you use to produce this marvelous source of power must get quickly used up. How, for instance, do you replace your zinc without going on shore?" "I will answer your questions in a moment," Captain Nemo replied. "First, however, I would like to mention that in the ocean depths there exists mines of zinc, iron, silver, gold, which would be quite easy to exploit, but I have used none of these earthly metals. I want to take only from the sea itself the means of producing my electricity." "The sea?" "Yes, Professor, and it was not difficult. In fact, by establishing a circuit between two wires at different depths, I could have obtained electricity through the resultant differences in temperature. But I preferred to use the more practical system." "What was that?" "You know the composition of seawater, don't you? Every 1,000 grams contains 96.5% of water and about 2 2/3% of sodium chloride, and then small quantities of magnesium chloride, potassium, magnesium bromide, magnesium sulfate and carbonate of lime. So you see that it contains a relatively large portion of sodium chloride, and it is this sodium that I extract from seawater and use as a basic element. Sodium? Yes, monsieur, when mixed with mercury, it forms an amalgam which can replace zinc in batteries. The mercury never gets used up. Only the sodium is consumed, and the sea itself furnishes me with a steady supply of it. And besides, let me tell you that sodium batteries are the most powerful of all, their electromotive force being double that of zinc batteries. I can well understand, Captain, the excellence of such sodium. The sea contains it, fine, but you still have to manufacture it, extract it. How do you manage that? Your batteries could obviously be used in this process, but if I'm not mistaken, the amount of sodium used up in this process would be greater than the amount extracted. You would therefore be using it up faster than you could produce it. No, Professor. I don't extract it by means of batteries. I merely heat it by means of coal. Coal, I said. Yes, but gotten from the sea, replied Captain Nemo. Can you dig coal from underwater mines? Later you will see me do it. I only ask you to be a bit patient. You'll have plenty of time for patience. But keep this in mind. I get everything from the ocean. It produces my electricity, and electricity gives the Nautilus its heat, light, and movement. In short, its life. But not the air you breathe. Oh, I could make the air I need, but I could see no use in it since I can surface any time I want. But if electricity doesn't supply me with air, it at least operates the powerful pumps, which store it in special tanks, thus allowing me to remain in the ocean depths as long as I want. Captain, I said, I can only admire what you've done. You have obviously discovered something which other men will one day find out, the true dynamic force of electricity. I'm not so sure they will find it, Captain Nemo answered coldly. But in any case, you already know one use I've made of this precious source of energy. It gives us light that is more uniform and continuous than that of the sun. Now, look at this clock. It's electric and works with an accuracy that surpasses the finest chronometers. I've had it divided into 24 hours, like Italian clocks, because for me there exists no night or day, sun or moon, but only this artificial light that I bring with me to the ocean depths. As you can see, it is now 10 o'clock. Precisely. Another use of electricity, this dial in front of us indicates the speed of the Nautilus. It is connected by an electric wire to the patent log, and its needle tells me of the ship's actual speed. Right now, in fact, we are cruising at 15 knots. Marvelous, I replied. How right you were, Captain, to use such a source of power. It can replace wind, water, and steam. We are not through, Monsieur Aronnax, said Captain Nemo, getting up. If you will be kind enough to follow me, we'll visit the after part of the Nautilus. I was now familiar with the entire forward part of the submarine, and here is an exact description of how it was divided up, starting amidships and going forward to the spur on its prow. First, there was the dining room, 16.5 feet long and separated from the library by a watertight bulkhead. Then the library, also 16.5 feet long. Afterward came the big lounge, 33 feet long, separated from the captain's room, which was 16.5 feet long. Then my cabin, 8 feet long, and lastly, an air reservoir, which was 24.5 feet long and extended up to the bow. That made a total of 115 feet. The watertight bulkheads had doors that could be hermetically closed by means of a kind of rubber gasket around the edge, and these doors made the Nautilus safe, even if it should spring a leak. I followed Captain Nemo down the gangway to the center of the ship. There I saw a kind of well between two watertight bulkheads. An iron ladder against the wall led to its upper end. I asked the captain where it led. To the dinghy, he replied. What? You have a dinghy on board? I exclaimed in surprise. Certainly. It is a splendid little boat, light and unsinkable. We use it when we want to go fishing or out for a stroll. But that means you have to surface in order to use it. Not at all. This dinghy is lashed to the upper part of the Nautilus's hull and set in a hollow place especially designed for it. It's completely covered by its own deck and thus absolutely watertight. It's held down with strong bolts. This ladder leads to a hatch in the Nautilus's hull, which corresponds to a similar hatch in the side of the dinghy. This allows me to go straight up into the dinghy. The crew closes one hatch, the one on the Nautilus, and I close the other by means of press screws. I then undo the bolts, and the boat shoots up to the surface. Once there, I open the hatch cover, which till now has been kept tightly closed, set up the mast and sails, or take out my oars, and I'm off. But then, how do you come back on board? I don't come back, Monsieur Aronnax. The Nautilus comes to me. At a command from you, I suppose? Yes, at a command from me. I remain attached to it by an electric wire. I send them a message, and that's that. Right, I said, intoxicated with all these wonders. Nothing could be simpler. After passing the stairs which led to the platform, I saw a cabin of about 6.5 feet long, in which Conseil and Ned Land were busy devouring their lunch. From there, a door opened into a 10-foot kitchen situated between the ship's vast storerooms. There, all the cooking was done by electricity, which for this purpose was even more powerful and obedient than gas. Platinum sponges, connected to electric wires and placed beneath the top of the stoves, gave off an even heat over a large area. Electricity was also used to heat a still, which, by means of evaporation, supplied excellent drinking water. Next to the kitchen, there was a well-laid-out bathroom, complete with hot and cold running water. Beyond the kitchen were the crew's quarters, about 16.5 feet long. But the door was closed, and I could not see how it was furnished, and hence, perhaps, get an idea of the number of men needed to operate the Nautilus. Then came a fourth watertight bulkhead separating this room from the engine room. A door opened, and I found myself in the compartment where Captain Nemo, undoubtedly a first-class engineer himself, had placed the machinery which drove his vessel. This well-lit room was at least 65 feet long. It was divided into two sections. The first contained the apparatus for producing electricity, and the second mechanism for transmitting this power to the propeller. I was first of all surprised by a rather peculiar odor which filled the compartment. Captain Nemo guessed my thoughts. "It comes from the gas given off in using sodium," he said. "But it produces nothing more than a slight discomfort. And besides, every morning we purify the ship by ventilating it with fresh air." In the meanwhile, I was examining the Nautilus's machinery with the greatest curiosity. "As you can see," said Captain Nemo, "I use Bunsen cells instead of those developed by Ruhmkorff, which would have been useless. The Bunsen cells are few, but large and powerful, which, in my experience, is an advantage. The electricity passes back through big electromagnets, actuating a set of rods and gears which in turn transmit the power to the propeller shaft. The propeller is 20 feet in diameter and can do up to 20 revolutions per second." "What speed does that give you?" 15 knots. There was a mystery behind all this, but I did not want to ask too many questions. How could electricity be made to produce such power? Where did this almost limitless force originate? Was it in some high tension developed by a new kind of coil? Was there something about its transmission that an unknown system of levers could increase infinitely? There was no way of knowing. Captain Nemo, I said. I'm fully aware of the results, and I don't expect any explanations. I saw the Nautilus maneuver around the Abraham Lincoln, and I'm well acquainted with its speed. But that isn't enough. You have to be able to see where I'm going. You have to be able to steer the ship to the right, to the left, up and down. How do you reach the great ocean depths, where the water pressure has to be counted in the hundreds of atmospheres? How do you come back to the surface? And lastly, how do you stay at a desired depth? I hope I'm not being too inquisitive. Not at all, Professor, replied the captain after a moment's hesitation. In view of the fact that you're destined never to leave this submarine, come into the lounge. That is our real workroom, and there I'll tell you everything you want to know about the Nautilus. And we'll stop right there at the end of chapter 12. Got a little bit of a science lesson there, not only in marine animals and works of great art, but also now we are getting to know how he has manipulated elements to create electricity. It's worth noting at this point that electricity at this age was kind of a novelty. It was not as commonplace as it is now. And so they kind of go on a lot about it because at this time it required a little bit more explanation than was usual. People were not as familiar with it. They tended to use gas a lot more, especially for lighting and things like that. So there it is, a little bit more information there about the Nautilus itself. We'll continue with our adventure on Monday as we reach chapter 13 and 14. I hope you can join me. Have a good weekend. We will be back here Monday at 4 p.m. Take care, everyone. Have a good one.